Hello everyone, Chris Fonsi and Greg Ruiz back again to talk about the subtle nuances of API design.
And in this particular segment, the even subtler nuances of metadata.
We're actually getting into some of the nether reaches of API design, if you will, at this point. But these are things that are really interesting and good for you to know because they represent kind of best practices around how to handle certain very specific circumstances. Metadata is actually a great one. In this particular case, we're looking at an example where an additional query parameter, metadata equals 1, has been used to expose metadata. And that metadata is itself a series of hyperlinks, which ties very nicely to what we talked about previously.
Yeah, that's actually a great idea that I'd never even thought of, is the idea of being able to let the developer, once again, going back to one of our earlier points, be in control and say, hey, I want this, or no, I want to suppress this, I want a smaller payload. I think it's a wonderful idea.
Yeah.
Now, of course, it brings up the thought of, if I can toggle that on and off, then I can also perhaps provide a lot richer detail in that metadata.
You could do. And in fact, there's probably a lot of cases where you would want to do a little bit more than what's been done in this particular case. This, for example, just provides a list of links. The links have associated names, but some of these names are not necessarily obvious to people unless they're working specifically with this API.
But like Dropbox we've got an example that it truly is very rich in terms of the data that's being provided.
Dropbox is nice. I mean, the metadata that they provide is fairly specific to what they do, right, as a storage mechanism, right? But they'll give you the size, they give you the current revision of the file, they'll tell you when it was created, they'll give you the specific path, and so on. So there's a lot of really nice information here that you can use to make your own application even richer, right?
Now, when you start thinking about putting this kind of data into your metadata, I guess one of the things that we then have to start thinking about is naming conventions and what makes sense, right? Especially as we even think about moving between quote unquote programming models.
Yeah, and this is actually a topic that reaches even far beyond metadata, just to attribute naming in general.
Right.
So generally, a lot of programmers nowadays are very comfortable with JSON. They retrieve JSON objects where there's a name and a value associated with various properties of the object, right? Those names can vary all over the map. I mean, you can see, for example, Twitter's using created_at in one case. Bing has date time with the D and the T capitalized. Foursquare is using camel case with created at. So there's all sorts of ways you can do this.
Well, and notice even the data itself, the different formatting.
Right.
Twitter providing that very long, somewhat very obvious and rich, if you think about it, way of providing me with the date and time, whereas Foursquare's Unix time code becomes a little bit harder for me to understand. So I think that's also a topic of not only just the attributes, but exactly how do you want to standardize upon the data that you're bringing back.
Right, and the standardization, I think, is the important point in what you said. So when we talk about creating these types of objects, it's certainly easy for us to return, say, a Linux timestamp, right, or date timestamp, because the underlying system may be Linux. There's no particular processing on our part that we need to do, and yet that's not intuitively obvious in some cases. So generally what we say is that when you are retrieving this type of data, that you standardize the formats, and you also standardize the names. So for example, if you're working with JavaScript, working with camel case type names, it's fairly intuitive, right? Not a big deal. With names, or with values rather, you can look at using Linux timestamps, and of course the Medio case. I never even knew the fancy name of the case. But very straightforward, I think, for most JavaScript programmers to use. And generally speaking, I'd say it's probably pretty simple for most people to use, regardless of whether they're writing iOS code, Java code for Android, or .NET code.
But I think that, again, back to that key of standardization, it's also just about being consistent, picking one route that you're going to go, and making sure that each implementation. Each time you're calling a date or whatever, it's always going to be in that same format. You don't want to be switching things up on people, making them guess.
Right. Makes perfect sense. Authentication is one of those areas that has been subject of a lot of debate over time. There are lots of different ways to authenticate. I'm sure you guys are familiar with HTTP basic authentication, where you're basically providing a user ID and password that are base64 encoded. Not exactly what I would say secure, but certainly used.
At least you've done something.
Absolutely. You've at least done something. And obviously you'd want to ship those things over a secure connection as well.
Absolutely.
In the OAuth realm, of course, there's OAuth 1.0a, which is an older standard, somewhat complex to implement because it requires HMAC signatures and can be a little bit complicated for some people. OAuth 2.0, which is the current version of the standard, has had its share of controversy, but it's kind of emerged as being the standard way to approach authentication for most API platforms. And it's really not inordinately difficult to use. There's a little bit of a learning curve in terms of understanding the situations in which you might use the different grant types of OAuth, but generally speaking, it's pretty straightforward. And so we recommend as a general rule that you go ahead and use OAuth 2.0. If you use some of the other standards, they might potentially appeal to other parts of your user community, if you will, for your APIs. But I think nowadays most developers generally understand how to use OAuth, and in fact there's a fairly rich set of client-side libraries that you can use. So if you're someone who prefers SDKs, for example, like me, then
I have the simplest way. I just let Facebook handle the whole thing.
You can do that as well.
Because they've got an API.
You can do that as well. Well, and that's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of people who do use standards like OpenID or Facebook Connect or something like that, and that works perfectly well as well. The interesting thing, though, in the context of APIs, though, is now that you've got this authentication in place, how do you represent the current user?
Yeah, that's very, very clear. Very obvious who I am. I'm me, right? And in fact, that is actually a pattern that a lot of these API providers have chosen to go with. Facebook is a great example. LinkedIn gives you two possibilities, either through the /people and the person logged in, or as a me. So I think once again, we want to just be clear that we're doing something that's obvious and consistent. Back to that same idea again.
Right. I mean, the concept of using me is pretty straightforward. Using something like self is also pretty straightforward. The nice thing about this, though, is that it hides the complexity of exactly who you are in terms of the API from the consuming application. So you can just reference the currently authenticated user as me or as self, and the API can take care of figuring out who that is in the context of their particular application.
Right. Absolutely.
Super simple. Right. Absolutely. And in fact, using something like me or people me is kind of the way to go, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a lot of APIs out there, and I think one of the most useful things, I remember, when I started out on the web, one of the ways that, I was learning, and I think we all still learn, is doing that good old view source. Hey, let me go look at their code. I think that in the API world, that's also a fabulous way to dive into not just consuming other APIs, but also thinking about designing our own. Is taking inspiration from others. What has Facebook done? What does their API look like? Right. So one of the great things I think that is to go take a look at some APIs that I'm not going to say are maybe emulate's a bad word, but that you might want to look at to see how did they tackle a given problem.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely the case. I've looked at a number of APIs just to try to get a sense, not necessarily for what's right or wrong, but just some of the different techniques that you could use. And I've played around with some of these things and, gotten familiar to the point where I have some personal preferences as to how to do things. Right. And I think fundamentally that's what a lot of API designers and developers would do. If you have an opportunity, for example, to look at Twilio or Facebook, Stripe, DigitalOcean, some of these other guys, you'll see that they have fairly clear ways of articulating their API. They've got pretty good documentation. Their APIs are generally pretty consistent. Right. You wouldn't, may not necessarily agree with the particular mechanism that they use for their API, but at least you can kind of understand what it is they did and why, and then you can make some intelligent decisions on your own part as to whether that's a pattern that you'd like to follow or if you'd like to do something different.
Well, and as a developer, I can tell you one of the things that I take away from that is also that idea of reinventing the wheel. Instead of going down trying to figure out how to implement my own API, if there's one out there that's publicly available, it's a great way to get familiar with what's out there in the marketplace as well, and say, hey, you know what? Instead of building it, I'll just use this one that's already been built.
Agreed. Totally agree. So at this point, then, we've pretty much wrapped up some of the core design concepts for APIs. We've talked about a lot of different topics. We started at talking about the Richardson maturity model and REST and resources and collections and whatnot. We've gone through HTTP verbs and hypermedia and error codes and metadata and
Right.
all that stuff.
I think we're basically to a point where we're almost done, or at least we can build our first one. But the big question is going to happen is we talked about that idea of just get it done, just toss something out there, because you can always grow.
Right.
So as we grow, I think we're going to need to begin thinking about how do we handle that growth pattern. In other words, how do we handle versioning of our APIs?
Right.
And I think we should do that in our next segment.